So this is going to be the first of a three-part series where I break down one of the most common questions that I get on Instagram and sometimes here on YouTube, and that is, what is the power setting of the light that I'm using to take the picture that I'm showing? And the answer to that question might seem really simple, but I actually never know that information because this is not a data point that I record or write down or even think about. And I think the question that the person is asking me might show a fundamental misunderstanding of how lighting and photography works. I think for the most part, many people think that they can put the same setting into their flash and the same settings that I'm using into their camera and automatically get the same picture. But they're not understanding that there are many variables that go in to getting that picture correctly exposed, and the power setting is not a very reliable number. So I'm going to go into why it is that that power setting is not very useful information and why I wouldn't rely on it. Then in the second video, I'm going to go over how to nail your exposure. You can use either trial and error, I'll talk about how to use a gray card, and then I'll talk about how to use a light meter, and also go over how to judge, test pictures, and make sure that you're getting things dialed in just right. And speaking of dialing things in the third video, I'm going to go over how to set up your camera so that you can photograph with artistic intent and get the results that you're really looking for. I created this series because it really concerned me that so many people were asking the same questions over and over again, and I felt like they really didn't understand the fundamentals that go into creating a great image and a correct exposure. So I want to empower you through this series to photograph with artistic intent and get those great images that you're looking for. So I'm sure you've noticed that flashes come in different power ratings. Maybe they are 100, 200, 400, or 500. These numbers are all in watt seconds. That is the common way that flashes are marketed. Then the problem, though, is that this number is actually not an expression of the output of the light. It's an expression of how much energy the light is using in order to produce a flash. And so because of that, you can have one model that's taking 500 watt seconds of power and outputting a certain volume of light. And you can have another model that is also taking up 500 watt seconds of energy and then outputting a different volume of light. And so having the power setting on a 500 watt Elechrome strobe and a 500 watt Pro Photo strobe is not really going to be that accurate of information. In fact, things change as you add a reflector or put these units in a softbox. And I'll show you a table right now so that you can see some results that I got using a light meter with flashes from these two brands. As you can see, when the power setting is set to the exact same amount, the actual brightness of the flash is different from one model to the next. Now, this shouldn't be taken to mean that the relationship between these two brands is always going to be the same. In fact, I would expect that when you take a flash from one brand that's 500 watt seconds and you test it against a flash from another brand that's 500 watt seconds, and then another model from the same brand that's 500 watt seconds, that the results are all going to be different. And I don't think that one brand is always going to be brighter than the other. It's going to be an up and down sort of thing. And so this is the first variable that makes this number or power setting question unreliable. Now, the next problem that you're going to encounter is that different brands use different scales in order to express the power that they're outputting. They don't just say that right now I'm set to 43 watt seconds. They'll say something like I'm set to 1/16 or I'm set to power setting 4 or 3.3 or something like that. It could be a fraction, it could be a number. The problem with that when we talk about fractions is if I give you a fraction, you need to know that that's a fraction of what number. So if I say that the flash is set to 1/8, if you don't know what power the flash goes up to, then you don't know how bright that is. If we're using the Pro Photo system and I tell you that the power setting is 8, well, you don't know what the maximum power setting, you don't know what the maximum output is on that flash. And so then you don't know what 8 means, because on most Pro Photo lights, the power setting rating goes from 0 to 10 or 4 to 10. 10 is always maximum power on that light for the most part. Now, on the Elinchrom lights, they use a scale where 6.3 equals 500 watt seconds and 5.3 equals 250 watt seconds, give or take. I have no idea why this number ends in 0.3, but it always does. The good thing with the Elinchrom lights, though, is if I turn one model to 4.3 and I turn another model to 4.3, they're going to output about 131 watt seconds. They're going to consume about 131 watt seconds, and then they're going to output about the same brightness in power. The idea is that if you set one of their lights to 4.3 and you have another model also set to 4.3, they should reasonably be close. So all of these things can be very difficult unless we're talking about watt seconds. But then again, we're back to the first problem, where watt seconds isn't an expression of luminance, it's an expression of power consumption. The next thing we need to consider is the inverse square law. And I have a video that's all about this if you want to check it out. But just know that light falls off rapidly as it travels away from the light source. Every time that you double the distance, you quarter the light. So just getting those distances wrong, if you don't have the distance, is going to cause a problem. And as I just said, it needs to be in the same modifier. That's the other factor. Let's say that I'm using a 3-foot umbrella, but you think I'm using a 4-foot umbrella. Let's say I didn't tell you the size of the modifier. Well, it's going to take a lot less energy to use a 3-foot umbrella than it will to fill a 3-foot umbrella and get that light to come forward. It's going to take less energy to use than if you use a 4-foot umbrella and fill that modifier and get the light to come forward from that modifier. So that can then change our exposure too. The other factor to consider is, let's say that you're photographing in a small white bedroom or your kitchen or something like that, and you have a white ceiling and you have white walls and a bright floor. But I'm photographing in a studio environment with 12-foot ceilings and concrete everywhere that's not very reflective, and plenty of room between my subject, the light hitting my subject, and then this area over here. Well, I'm not going to have things bouncing back. But if you're photographing in that small room, your light's going to hit your subject. It's going to also hit the wall. It's also going to bounce back. And that's going to make it so that even if you have the same modifier at the same distance with the same light set to the same setting, that your exposure is going to be slightly brighter than my exposure. And most definitely, your fill will be brighter than my fill. So that's a factor too. Also, skin tone is a factor. When I'm photographing someone with a fairly dark skin tone, I might overexpose them slightly in order to maintain or get more detail, because often a darker skin tone will come with darker hair, and I want to preserve that shadow detail. But if you use my settings and you have every variable the same, but you're photographing someone with a very light skin tone and gray or blonde hair, well, now all of a sudden your image is going to look half a stop brighter than my image. Let's talk about a real world scenario, how this could go down and how you could end up in a lot of trouble using the power setting that I'm using, thinking that you're doing the right thing. So let's assume for a second that we're both using the same brand of lights. And I tell you that my power setting is at 1/8 because we're both using fractions. But you look at the behind the scenes photo and you think that I'm using a 400 watt second flash at 1/8, and I'm actually using a 600 watt second flash at 1/8. So you set your 400 to 1/8 and I have my 600 at 1/8. Well, guess what? My shot is going to be properly exposed because that's what we're looking at, the properly exposed shot. But now your shot is going to be half a stop darker just with this one setting that's gone wrong. Okay, so now you look at my behind the scenes photo and you think that my light is 4 feet, but it's actually 3 feet or 90 centimeters from the subject. And because of that, you're too far away, and because of the inverse square law, your shot is now another half stop underexposed. So now your shot is a full stop underexposed. Now, let's say that you were looking at that photo and you thought that the light was 4 feet away. So you thought that given that I was using a 4-foot or 120 centimeter modifier. But actually I was using a 3-foot or 90 centimeter modifier because I was using a smaller modifier closer up and you thought I was using a bigger modifier further away. Well, let's just say for the sake of argument that my 3-foot modifier or 90 centimeter modifier, it's going to take less energy. It's going to be more efficient and output more light than your 4-foot modifier. And so let's say that that's another half stop difference between the 3-foot modifier and the 4-foot modifier. Well, now all of a sudden you are 1.5 stops darker than my picture. And if you've looked at a photo where there's a 1.5 stop difference between the two, the second one is going to be very, very dim. And we got down this road just because you thought it was the wrong light, you thought it was the wrong distance, and you thought it was the wrong modifier. Now, let's say that we were using different brands. Then there's an efficiency problem that could get in there. Let's say that we're in a different size room or our subject has a different skin tone. We could very easily end up in a situation where your results are 1 stop off of mine, or they could be 2.5 stops off of mine. All based on the idea that you input the same power setting that I input, but all of these variables were different. What helps me is knowing how bright the light is when it hits the subject. Most of the time I use a light meter, but in part 2, we're going to go over how to use trial and error, how to judge different photos at different exposures, and maybe how to use a gray card or something that you find that's neutral gray in order to get a proper exposure, or a light meter like I do. If there's one number that's actually good, reliable information when it comes to getting the right exposure, it is the light meter paired with the camera settings. And the camera settings are what we're going to go over in part 3. If you want to take your learning to the next level, be sure to check out my in-person workshops. Soon I'll be going to Charlotte. I'll be having one at my studio here in Chicago. Then I'll be going to Dallas and Las Vegas. So for more information and to find new dates and locations, just go to johngress.com/workshops. Well, I think that about wraps it up. If you have any questions or comments, just leave those below. If you could please like, subscribe, and sign up for the bell, I would really appreciate it. Also, I'll link to any of the gear that I'm using in the description. I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you soon.